If this goes on, don't panic. Bringing hope to the world through speculative fiction.
Today we continue our new series on hope in horror. In our last column, our guest talked about the show Yellow Jackets. Oh, and sorry about that weird glitch last time. I'll try and figure that out. This time, Paul will confront Godzilla himself and discuss how the newest kaiju movie gives him hope. He also discusses the balance between hope and horror and how they change a story. Before we get started, remember to share us with your friends or check out our Ko-fi and Patreon accounts if you like what we're doing. Today, our columnist is Paul Jessup. Paul is a critically acclaimed, award-winning writer of spooky stuff. His latest books are Glass House, a haunted house novel, The Skinless Man Counts to Five, and Other Tales of the Macabre, a short story collection, and A Daughter of the Wormwood Star, a horror novel about a satanic cult. He has been published and translated in many different countries, including England, Ireland, Poland, and Japan. He's an active pro member of HWA, and he's had publications in countless magazines over the years. Dang, there's that noise again. What is happening? I'll be right back.
Do not panic. Do not adjust your headphones. There is nothing wrong with your computer or cell phone. We have taken over this podcast. But do not be alarmed. We're here to talk to you about hope and horror. Hello, I'm your host Paul Jessup, stepping in for a little bit to discuss some light in our collective darkness. Some people would say that hope is anathema to horror, but I would disagree. Horror is a complicated thing, and a very big tent that can fit in all sorts of shapes and shadows. Hope doesn't limit horror, but instead expands it. In today's episode, we're going to discuss the latest in the Godzilla franchise, Godzilla -1. Some would say it's the best Godzilla movie since the original, and I think I might hesitatingly agree on that. Its scenes of horror are very horrific, but its tender, human heart is extremely hopeful. But I'm getting ahead of myself here, aren't I? Godzilla -1 is the only movie I can think of that not only embraces hope and horror, but also makes its central theme to the entire thing. And using this movie as a lens, we can see how hope and horror work and play against each other, and with each other, and what it means when we introduce hope into a work of terror. It's a tricky tightrope act. Whether it's a movie, a book, or a short story, there is the risk that adding in too much of one will invalidate the other. It's far too easy for hope to diminish the terror, or for terror to wipe out the hope and leave nothing behind. I call this the Stephen King Conundrum. In a lot of books where he leans more hopeful, the horror lessens, and he leans more into the horror, the hope feels lost and lonely. But when it's done exceptionally well, it can be a powerful tool. The hope can enhance the horror instead of lessening it. It gives weight to the characters, to their struggles, and to their fears. And Godzilla -1 does this exceptionally well. After rewatching the movie for the umpteenth time before working on this podcast, I thought of my H-Word article, The Melancholy Beauty of Terror, published in Nightmare magazine. In it, I tried to reason out what could be a core definition of horror across all the various subgenres and styles. And I reasoned that horror, as a fictional genre, is all about death. Wrestling with the fear of death, exploring the various horrible ways we could die. It was death without gloss or glory, death deep and meaty, death, the terrible and bright. And it made me think about how hope interacts with terror in Godzilla -1. The main message, repeated over and over again, was to live. That living itself was an act of rebellion against death, and that in itself is hope. But it doesn't weaken the terror of death, but instead strengthens it by giving it meaning and weight. Here, let's take a deeper dive into Godzilla -1 to see exactly what I mean by this, shall we? Be warned, here there be spoilers. So, if you haven't seen the movie yet and don't want to be spoiled, Go and watch it now. It's okay. I can wait. It's a great movie and it's worth it. All right. Everybody ready to look at the hope and horrors in Godzilla -1? Good. So let's take a look at the horror first, shall we? They are manifold. We start with the horrors of war and the horrors inside of oneself. A kamikaze pilot abandons his mission for fear of his own death. And then he lands on an island, afraid to let anyone know what he's done. This fear of what's inside of him, the need to run, to escape terror, and not to fight. Godzilla appears here, and the horror of war becomes a visceral, terrifying spectacle in the shape of this giant kaiju. Our ex-kamikaze pilot experiences more terror and trauma, having a pile up inside of him. As you can see, it's not just the horrors of a giant monster, but rather the horrors of death, war, and of running when you should fight. Later on, he meets a woman in the bombed-out shell of a city with a child. The child isn't her child, but instead thrust on her by a dying mother. He takes them in, and his neighbor questions him on this, asks him why he's doing such an act of kindness. After all, she says, she won't care for anyone anymore in this cruel world. All she has left is this one bag of rice, and it's hers. But then she asks him if the woman in his house can breastfeed the baby. When he says no, she's not the mother, his neighbor gives him her last bag of rice. Here is the first note of hope amongst all of this horror. In a lesser work, this would remove some of the terror and the story would be less scary. But in Godzilla -1, it does just the opposite. Here we've seen the horrors. We know how awful they can be. And this one act of kindness, as a rebellion against the nihilistic nature of the world, adds a note of hope that deepens our emotional connection to the characters. And in this, the horror deepens, because we watch the characters who live so quickly die in the hands of Godzilla no more than 10 minutes before. We've seen the destruction, and we know that in this point in time, there is no way they could survive without work, money, or food. This creates a pressure cooker of fear and terror. The kaiju specter of death looming large. And through this hope, we connect to the characters and we want them to live. And this needing to live, this drive to live, is the main key. It gives this movie the sense of hope and horror. The main character struggles with his trauma and struggles with death drive and thoughts of suicide. He's haunted by the actions of war and of Godzilla and being unable to save everyone. Another theme in this movie is sacrifice. And in the end, the sacrifice itself is a moment of hope, because he finds a way to save everyone without sacrificing himself. There is still fear throughout all of this. The danger is still real because we watch people we care about suffer and die throughout the whole movie. But in the end, there is hope. It is not a hope for life after death, but instead hope that life can laugh in the face of death. That this absurd, cruel universe won't get us down and despondent, but instead we can fight back. And it means all the more because the world is terrifying, is horrible, is destructive, and will devour you. And yet, we live. We live and keep on living. That is rebellion. That is hope and horror. These are the things that terrify us and can also heal us and set us free. And before we head off, I would just like to bring up my own little bit of hope and horror, and the struggle against death and living against terrifying odds. My next book, Daughter of the Wormwood Star, comes out October 8th. My deliriously surreal Antichrist witch cult road trip novel, published by Underland Press. Buy it and find bookstores everywhere. I'm going to leave you all here now and let the podcast return back to normal. Think about what I've said and let me know how you experience hope and horror, and if it mirrors what we've talked about already. Until next time, may the darkness shine bright and the shadows set you free.